Hey, hi, I'm Alicia, and this is my final project on social and personality development this term. Stereotype threats and performance. The term stereotype threat was first introduced in 1995 by researchers Aronson and Steele, defined as being at risk of confirming a negative stereotype about one's group. We'll be looking at the study a little bit later. In part 1 here, I'll be looking at 2 readings from the last week of this course. Gonzalez, Odig, Schmader, and Barron's study looked at stereotype threats within male-female gender contexts in preschoolers and kindergartners, the stereotype being that girls are bad at math. They ran 2 studies with over 200 children aged 3 to 6 in each one. The children were given approximate number system tests, and afterwards they were given explicit questions about math gender stereotypes. Results were about as expected. Girls who believed that boys were better at math made more mistakes than both male participants and other girls who didn't believe that boys were better at math, confirming the hypotheses about this stereotype threat. Now, bouncing off of that, a paper by Ambadi, Sheikh, Kim, and Patinsky also looked at the effects of gender stereotype threats, and added ethnicity as a further stereotype threat to study. The participants of their study were Asian American schoolgirls from kindergarten to middle school age. All participants were subjected to one of 3 conditions: Asian identity activated, gender identity activated, or no identity activated. That is the control condition. After the manipulation, the participants were led to different rooms, where they were given standardized math tests, and afterwards they were asked to complete 2 implicit ethnic and gender awareness tests and 1 explicit stereotype awareness test. The results were that middle school and lower elementary school children showed results in the direction expected. They performed better in ethnic identity activated and worse in gender identity activated conditions. Upper elementary school children, however, performed better in the gender identity activated condition. This was hypothesized to be because children at that age are predisposed to believing that their gender is better than the other. They found similar results in the implicit tests, with children believing that Asians were better than Caucasians at math, and boys were better than girls, except in upper elementary school children who believed that girls would be better than boys at math. There weren't any significant results in the explicit tests. Explicitly, the children stated that both genders and races would perform equally. Reading through these studies, I had 3 major questions. What other stereotype threats apply? And would they produce a similar reaction to a similar extent? Is it universal or cross-cultural to the same extent? And would non-visual stereotypes affect people the same way? I'll be using these questions to frame the following 4 studies listed. Now, these questions are not mutually exclusive, and they're not my research question, but I feel that answering them would provide a better framework going forward as to why I chose my hypotheses. We'll only be looking briefly at Aronson and Steele's study. It was completed over 20 years ago, and it's pretty outdated at this point. The next 3 studies we'll be looking at were published within the last couple of years, but the implications of this study, as well as the fact that it was one of the first looks that we had into stereotype threats, make for a good background on this subject. What Aronson and Steele did was along similar lines as the previous 2 studies that we've looked at, but instead of Asian American schoolgirls, they had African American college students, in comparison with white students, and tested using GRE test materials. African American school students were found to perform worse when a stereotype threat was activated. The implications of this study are that stereotype threats affect different ethnicities than what we've looked at so far, and that the effects still linger well into adulthood. The Sombre and Negmar and Delelis completed their study on stereotype threats for students with physical disabilities. In this study, lower extremity disabilities, that is, those who were wheelchair confined due to spinal trauma, congenital disease, accidents, etc. The participants were randomly assigned to simulated in-group and or out-group conditions. Simulated in-group or out-group conditions, dependent on whether the imaginary judges were stated to have a disability or not. And these participants were given progressive matrices to fill out. The results supported the Sombre's hypotheses. Disabled students in the out-group condition performed poorly in comparison to those in the in-group condition. Now, Cardabasi and Tomasetto's study focuses on the stereotype threat that overweight people are less intelligent. They gathered participants, measured their BMI, and randomly assorted them into 3 conditions before they were given working memory tests. The 3 conditions were the control condition, where they were given normal instructions, the high-threat condition, where it was emphasized that intelligence was measured, and the low-threat conditions, where the tasks that were described only as distractor tests. The results found were that there was a negative correlation between BMI and working memory in the high threat and controlled conditions. That is, participants with higher BMI performed poorly. In the low threat conditions, however, there was no correlation, suggesting that the stereotype threat was the cause of these results. Wang's study was a little bit different. Instead of seeing how other stereotypes affect academic performance, researchers Wang, Pradam, and Chen looked at how academic performance itself forms a type of stereotype threat. Wang and co. had two main hypotheses: that academically poorly performing children would be more vulnerable to stereotype threats, and that the children with high reported self-esteem would be more vulnerable due to overcompensation. Participants involved were from a public middle school. Researchers identified those in the lowest 15% academically ranking. Researchers began with two open-ended questions about student opinions on people with poor grades, and incorporated these answers into creating their stereotype threat eliciting sentences, which were then interspersed with a mental rotation task. The control condition involved neutral sentences. Now, there was a separate self-esteem test that was conducted with Rosenberg's 10-point self-esteem scale. The results reflected were that the team's expected hypothesis was proven. Low-achieving students performed worse in stereotype threat-activated conditions than in control conditions, and low-achieving students with high reported self-esteem in particular performed worse than low-achieving students with low reported self-esteem. Now, these previous studies shed little light on the different types of stereotype threats, their effects on performance, and their prevalence. There are several different factors, as we've seen so far: gender, race, disability, BMI, and academics, and current research likely hasn't even looked at all of the possibilities yet. They're also cross-cultural to some extent, as all previous studies were conducted in America, Italy, France, and China, respectively. There's also evidence that stereotype threats apply to non-visual markers, such as Wang's academic study. So, for my hypothetical research study, I want to focus on a different area that I haven't been able to find too much research for. I want to target the stereotype that lower socioeconomic status, a non-visual stereotype, reflects on performance. As we've seen, stereotype threats exist across cultures, so I would want to focus the study on Asia, which culturally places a higher emphasis on socioeconomic status than North American cultures. I'm basing this assumption partly on my own experience and partly from inferences from research studies that I've read on self-esteem and status in Asia, which I will be including in the submitted PDF. Now, my research question here is, are students with lower socioeconomic status vulnerable to stereotype threat? Seeing as I've been able to find very little information directly on this topic, I'm concluding that there's a gap in current literature on the subject, and it would be important to look into. My hypothesis would be that lower SES participants, being the discriminated minority, would be more susceptible to stereotype threat than higher SES participants. Ideally, our participants would be students in the middle school to high school range, as older children are more likely to be sensitive to socioeconomic status than younger children. Now, participants would likely be from varying SES ranges, self-reported, or if possible, collected through parental income data. Another segmentation possible would be students on scholarship versus students paying in full, in the case of private schools. Like in Gardabasi and Tomasetto's study, I think the methods would start with manipulations here, and the ideal manipulations would involve low stereotype threat conditions, a control condition, and high threat conditions. This could be achieved through including stereotype threat eliciting sentences throughout the task, like in Wang's study. I feel like a good performance test here is a working memory task, as it's been used in several of the studies that we've seen so far. And studies have also shown that anxiety, which would be caused by the stereotype threat here, affects working memory. I propose that the results of my study would be that low SES participants would be more susceptible to stereotype threats in high threat conditions and possibly control conditions. There would also be a larger gap in performance between low and high SES participants in the high and control conditions than in the low threat conditions, which would show minimal difference. So, a couple of takeaways here. The implications of my study, were to be proven true, would be to explore a gap in the literature of stereotype threats here. It would also provide further insight on reducing stereotype threats in academic settings. I've listed some of my key takeaways here. There are many other areas of this study that is yet to be explored, but so far, I'm going to stop here. Thank you for listening, and I apologize for all of the lags in the video.